Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center. I'm Susan Derwin. I'm the director of the IHC, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today to our Humanities Decanted series, which is the informal showcase of the IHC, where faculty members present and discuss their newest research and creative work. Before we begin our conversation today, I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located, and I would like to pay respect to elders, both past and present. I am so delighted to welcome distinguished research professor emerita Suzanne Jill Levine, my friend, from the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. Professor Levine is widely recognized as the editor of Penguin's paperback classics of Jorge Luis Borges and the translator of renowned Latin American writers such as Julio Cortázar, Carlos Manuel Puig, Cristina Rivera Garza, and others. Her original works include The Subversive Scribe, translating Latin American fiction, Manuel Puig and the Spiderwoman, His Life and Fictions, and Unfaithful, a translator's memoir, which she will be discussing today. She has been honored with many awards, including PEN Prizes, NEA Fellowships, and NEH grants for literary translations. Professor Levine is going to be in conversation with Leo Cabranes-Grant, Professor of Literature, Performance, and Intercultural Poetics in the Departments of Spanish and Portuguese and Theater and Dance. In addition to his prolific output of scholarly monographs, 4 books of poetry, and a collection of award-winning plays, Professor Cabranes-Grant just published a new book, Kierkegaard and the Performatics of Philosophy, in December of 2025, and I would like to invite everybody to say performatics 3 times. We will begin with a short presentation by Professor Levine, and then she and Professor Cabranes-Grant will speak with each other for about 30 or 35 minutes. Following their conversation, we'll open the discussion to you, our audience members, so that you can ask questions and share your thoughts. And please do feel free to continue to enjoy the snacks during the event. So now we'll start with Professor Levine's presentation. Enjoy.
Just in case you didn't know it. Anyways, well, this is an enormous pleasure to be presenting this book to my colleagues and friends here and some of my former students. It's a really a delight, and it's sort of even hard to know where to begin because it all goes back so far. But essentially, the book that we're going to celebrate today is really part, and actually one of my reviewers actually made me think of that, is really part of a trilogy, and a trilogy that began with The Subversive Scribe, and then moved on to the biography of Manuel Puig, and then to this book. And you know, what's curious about, for me, translation from the very beginning, aside from about the discovery of these wonderful writers, which I had, of course, the privilege to discover, and this is also another reason why there are many reasons why I wrote the book, but I think the first reason that's more conscious is that I wanted to bring them back because they've, you know, all these writers who were the famous and really innovative writers of the Latin American boom, pretty much they're no longer here. Of course, they're here in the memory of other writers and hopefully readers, but basically it's, you know, and that's what one would call this a memoir in the very literal sense of remembering, right? I wanted to remember, I wanted to resurrect them. I wanted us to somehow visit with them once again. And so that to me was a really strong part of why this book was written. But again, I say that began with the Subversive Scribe. I wrote the Subversive Scribe when I was I started to write it when I was still an assistant professor way back in the Middle Ages. And I mean, I can't remember them, but some of you probably can. And basically, the point of that book at that time, here I was a Latin Americanist. I had already written actually 2 books, one about Garcia Marquez. It was actually one of the first books about Garcia Marquez called El Espejo Hablado, The Spoken Mirror, which was a metaphor taken from his book. And so basically, I had already written about him. I had done my dissertation on the island novels of Bioy Casares, which was really about the origins and what fantastic literature really was, the Borgesian form of fantastic literature. And, but I was a translator. And in academe, way back in the 70s, you know, a translator was still a second-class citizen, you know, and certainly in the academic world, right? In other words, translators, people who were translating, they could not count translations as part of their, right, as part of their labor, as part of their scholarly work. And to me, this seemed so scandalous from so many points of view. Partly because I did my first translations with 2 very bilingual writers, Guillermo Cabrera Infante, the brilliant Cuban writer, whose history is very important and who you should know about, and Manuel Puig, and was the second writer who I collaborated with, and that was what we did. We collaborated on these first translations. And what I realized that translation is a totally creative activity, but also scholarly in the deepest sense, that you're doing the closest possible reading of a text as you possibly can. And what was also fascinating about this was that in going through the process of translation with these 2 really talented and incredible writers, you could see how the actual process was so much richer than the final product. I mean, what the decisions you make and all the different versions you go through, again, is like a process of discussion and reading of a work. So basically, I felt all this was missing in academe. And so that's why I decided to write The Subversive Scribe, which was a book which tried to show my process, the process of translation, by really discussing through various, I organized it through problems of translation that people are always thinking of, like how do you translate puns? How do you translate names? How do you translate, or do you translate names? How do you translate the source of the source, which is something that I discovered. Like if a writer if the book is built on Dante, so what are you going to do about that in English? Okay, all these kind of problems, and then ultimately the last chapter was about words themselves, which of course they're never really translated totally, right, faithfully. So so this was a book that really I felt needed to be written, and it was published then. But and when I finished that book, I said, and for me, translation is a rite of passage. Well, the rite of passage was to be a writer myself, and to write my own books, but my own books that are more, creative rather than purely scholarly. And so I was about to write a book that would have been a kind of series of essays, I guess personal essays about the various writers I had worked with and knew. This was way back in the late 80s. But in 1990, a tragedy occurred, which was the death of Manuel Puig, who had been really one of the writer I worked most with in some ways and closest to me in so many ways. And he was also an extremely original writer. I mean, he was a writer within the Latin American context. He was a writer who was quite misunderstood initially because his first novel was called Betrayed by Rita Hayworth, which has been reissued with a gorgeous photo of the mouth of Rita Hayworth. There we go. And he would have loved that. He would have loved that cover. The first cover was, I don't know if the first cover is here, no. But there are many different covers. Anyway, but essentially, this book was, certain writers like Cabrera-Infante and like Juan Goytisolo in Spain realized initially, immediately that this was a really original work. It was a work that was totally spoken, or the only people writing in it were the characters, and the characters were mainly women and children. This was very controversial in a very male and patriarchal system, which is of the Hispanic world, right? And but the fact that the title was Betrayed by Rita Hayworth, there were a number of very obviously people who were totally what's our life about now? But the Cuban Revolution, we have to have revolution. We have to, rebuild our Latin America and free it from oppression. And so, why is this guy talking about an American actress? That seems a little trivial, no? So, but it turns out that what was important about Manuel Puig is that he really brought in the whole field of sexual politics into the novel, which really wasn't there at that time. So I felt that he died, and I really had to really explain to the world why this writer, was so important, and that was what the biography was about, and of course, biographies are very, very complex projects, and but in any case, that was really the second part of what I was trying to do. And as finally, I decided. Well, before I retired, I was already working on this book, and it was going to be, again, as I said, a resurrection of these writers who were really incredible and important to us and who needed to be remembered. So that's how it all started, and I think that that's enough right now, and I think I'm going to have a conversation with this lovely gentleman over there. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this wonderful conversation. I would like to start by thanking the Humanities Interdisciplinary Center, Suzanne Jill Levine, the director, and the amazing staff that makes these welcoming events possible. I always feel at home here because that's what it is. It's the home of all of us. Today I have the pleasure, the almost overwhelming delight of talking with a friend of mine and also one of the most important translators of Latin American literature that we know. And I would like to start by making a statement which is that, I mean, as we know, writers make literature, but only translators make world literature. And what we have on the screen here is not only an amazing collection of translations made by Professor Levine, but also it's a group of work that has been substantial in doing canon formation and also canon reformation by calling attention to writers that maybe were not getting the same kind of coverage that other writers were and making them available across the world. So that is the kind of engine that Professor Levine has been. There have been some wonderful reviews related to Unfaithful, the translator's memoir. I'm going to mention them as we go along as a way to creating connections and also looking for questions. For example, Joe Henson from Middlebury Institute defines the Unfaithful as both provocation and ars poetica, a delight, a lively, candid, and intelligent work. And Samantha Shunei from Best Book 25 says that this memoir provides a front row seat to the boom, is fast-paced, and sometimes racy, more about that in a second, proof that the translator is a writer's closest reader. And in order to start the conversation, I think we need to start by reading at least some moments from the book as we go along. And I'm going to point at some favorite moments that I would like to hear you reading. And what about if we start with your encounter with Emango and Pablo Neruda?
Somebody's turned on. Okay, so yes, well, again, to continue before reading that section, one of the great fortunes that I had, because again, here I was, a very young woman, right out of, actually still in graduate school, and beginning to translate, and I got to meet one of the great literary critics of Latin American literature in New York, because of course New York is the center of everything, and I was in New York. And that's another reason why I think I was very fortunate, because that was the moment when publishers and the literary world was starting to recognize these writers. Anyway, so with Emir Rodriguez Morigal, this wonderful man in my life, we traveled to countries. We were at conferences. And occasionally we were even at banquets. So this is a what? Oh, sorry, at banquets. Oh, closer, banquets. Okay, banquets. This is a very intimate microphone. I've got kissed. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, so banquets, and this was probably the first banquet I ever went to, because I was a girl from Washington Heights, and not really from a banquet kind of class, So this was I have a chapter here which is called 3 Feasts with Neruda, who was absolutely a wonderful man in person. He was very warm, very lively, and it was just very exciting to be in his presence. So I'm looking for the page. Oh, it's page 132. Okay, last paragraph. Okay, so here I am, this young gringa who is surrounded by all these very classy-looking Latin Americans, and actually it was mainly in Venezuela, at the house of Jose Miguel Otero, who was a fabulous, Miguel Otero Silva, excuse me. I think I got the name right, yeah. Who was as, a very wealthy Venezuelan, obviously. In his multi-leveled modern house, there was, he had an actual sculpture by Moore and, other such things that he owned, which were quite impressive. And at that time, I didn't know that, private people could actually own, art. I thought it was only in museums. So I was really I was a naive little girl. Okay, so in any case, we were having this marvelous almuerzo. It was exquisite. As Neruda was not only a committed, as I say, communist, but a well-known gourmet, or perhaps gourmand. The challenge par excellence was dessert. A whole mango accompanied by a little silver paring knife. And they, by the way, very generously sat me next to Neruda, which was to Pablo. So the pleasant voice of Pablo came to my rescue when he saw my pained hesitation. Gilles, he pronounced correctly with the soft G, yo te lo corto. And he both gently and methodically cut my mango into edible pieces. To me, this act of chivalry seemed like the attentions of a lover. I felt both honored and speechless, and blushing deep red, managed to thank him. His wife, Matilde, at that point announced as the coffee was brought in that Pablo was going to take a siesta, and so the great man beside me got up and, as if by magic, vanished into the vast labyrinth of that luxurious home.
Well, the reason I asked you to revisit this mango moment with Pablo Neruda is because I think it encapsulates very well the double register that your memoir is traversing. I mean, your memoir seems to be proposing a deep connection between two kinds of intimacy. The translator, of course, dealing with another language, but also your own flesh, very much involved dealing with other bodies. You claim you have been unfaithful on both counts. And I want to know more about that. What you have called the close elaboration of being a translator and this constant back and forth between the flesh of language and the flesh of the body.
Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. And of course, this is right in time with the one of the important themes now in translation studies, because translation studies became translation studies during my academic career, and I think I had something to do with that. But the erotics of translation and the embodiment are actually themes that a number of translators deal with from a very theoretical point of view. Basically, close elaboration, of course, was a wonderful portmanteau word that Cabrera-Infante, who was considered the kind of Cuban Joyce, really, and we came up with this word close to say, after we translated Three Trapped Tigers, to say close elaborated by, because we worked together on it. By the way, the publisher, Harper and Row Cass Campfield Jr. said, "You guys do not touch the title page. We will not have that on the title page." So, however, close elaboration became something that people have referred to quite a lot, and I guess the use of unfaithful, and I do have a section where I could talk about that. I could read the use of unfaithful.
By all means, go for it.
Because actually, one of the people who reviewed my book said, you really shouldn't call yourself unfaithful. You're very faithful to all these writers. And I said, I know that, but it's kind of a little bit of humor, because obviously the fact that people could believe that translations are going to be totally faithful, totally literal, is utopic belief, right? So...
It's 158.
What?
Page 158.
158.
Yes.
Thank you, doctor. Okay. Page 158 we will go to. So this is my afterword, which I wrote an afterword just in case people didn't understand the book. Because I thought maybe they might take it to be another kind of book, so I wanted to make sure they thought it was the kind of book it was. Okay, so Unfaithful seeks to bring to the reader's attention a deeply personal view of the translator, with myself as protagonist, aware of performance as a key element, as if the translator were a kind of picaresque character whose creative adventure is an erotics of translation. The translator is a lover. And actually, with regards to this, I came across a wonderful quotation from Leo Tolstoy, who said, well, he said it in Russian, but I hope it was well translated, "Everything I know because I love." Okay. So I think the translator is a lover, but I also think the writer is a lover. Translation requires an intimate closeness with the text and at times with the authors themselves, a scenario in which there is inevitably a degree of unfaithfulness and distance. We need to understand that what may appear as a form of betrayal allows for the translator's subjectivity and her own voice to emerge in close dialogue with the original. We need to understand that the idea of fidelity is utopic and that no literary translation can ever be completely faithful in a literal sense. At its best, a translation plays two roles, as a critical interpretation and as a work of art that reproduces the original in a new form. The traditional raison d'etre, or ethical responsibility of translation, is to pass knowledge and wisdom down the generations. But translations are never the thing itself. When I first began to cultivate this creative practice of close elaboration, what stood out for me was that certain authors themselves were keen to show readers that what gets lost is merely the flip side of what gets gained. So, yeah.
Yes, and I think that's a great place to ask you then about some of the lovers.
Oh, the lovers.
Involved. We have some of their books here. Yeah. I mean, as a translator, you remind me a lot of Shakespeare's Cleopatra.
Oh.
Because, I mean, first of all, so much of this memoir is about your salad days and how they move you into this idea of translation.
Right.
But also, I mean, Mark Antony defines Cleopatra as someone with infinite variety. And there is an infinite variety of voices in your translations. I mean, just to give an example, I mean, of all the different voices that you have translated, Cabrera Infante and Severo Sarduy are Baroque, excessive, almost exhausting writers. Manuel Puig, on the other hand, is more colloquial, is more popular, is not afraid of being commercial-like in some of his prose. Yeah. Borges is a classicist of sorts when you put it all together. And Bioy Casares is influenced by science fiction, thrillers, intrigue, detective. And somehow you manage to find a voice for what is, by all means, an incredibly heterogeneous and rich variety. So to what extent is possible for you to share with us some of the alchemy, some of the magic that needs to happen for you to inhabit these other voices and become them?
Okay, that's fair enough. I was thinking, well, actually, while you were saying it, that at the very beginning of the book, I talk about my beginnings, and among them was the year I spent in Spain as a student, college student. I had only had 2 years of Spanish because my major originally had been French, and I decided to go to major in Spanish because I just thought that the Spanish teachers had a lot more joie de vivre than the French. So they were just much more fun. As a matter of fact, I remember one French teacher made me very nervous, and I was, too young to be made so nervous. But anyway, but going back to what you're saying, I think that part of what a translator, if a translator truly is gifted, it's part of what they have is a love of the language. And one of the things that excited me, even as a kid of 12 when I started to study French, was the idea of imitating these voices, of capturing the voice of the original language. And of course, dialogue, more than anything, intrigued me for that very reason, because, how do you, you know how everyday language is so not only colloquial, but most of what you say is not even said, right? So how do you capture that's what was not said in what you're saying, okay? So I think that I was drawn to this, and I do tell a story of an older, because I was the youngest kid with all these older, beautiful siblings, that my 2 sisters and a brother. And one of my sisters was an actress. And I do think, and my family, of course, being a typical New York family, with not a lot of money, we went to the movies all the time to get entertained. So, I mean, the movies, performance, actors, all this was very alive to me, very important to me. It was part of what the joys of life that one experienced every Saturday night, you know. So I think that this idea of performance is important, and I think that I chose to translate only certain writers because, you know, oftentimes I was offered a book that I didn't want to do because I wasn't particularly drawn to the writing, but I was drawn to writers whose language and whose, you know, mode of expressing themselves, often with a lot of humor, certainly sometimes very subtle humor, but with a great deal of irony. I mean, these were among the elements that appealed to me, and Manuel Puig and Bioy Casares were, of course, both very humorous and charming men, and these were the ones that I was, you know. Anyway, but that's the only ones. I mean, of all the writers I translated, I thought I was rather limited in those racy ways, you know, when you kind of think of it. But you have to remember that this was the late 60s, early 70s. That was a totally different era. You know, the sexual revolution was happening, feminism was happening, and you know, just as, you know, Kennedy was the president, and there was the, you know, the Program for Progress, what was called the Alliance for Progress, and you know, the Peace Corps, which of course was about reaching out and reaching out to other people, to helping other people, but also it was kind of like an orgy of togetherness, you know, and there was not a lot of, you know, there was not, certainly where I lived in New York, that atmosphere and the universities, colleges, there was a lot of openness about sexuality. So, I mean, you know, one was, you know, it was part of life, you know, and so that's where some of my relationships came in. And certainly when you're working in an art form with an artist, you know, the intensity, of course, is incredible. And so that certainly brings you closer, you know, so I think that had a lot to do with it. But, you know, I did most of the writers I translated, some of them I really was close to, even though we weren't lovers. For example, Cabranes-Grant. First of all, his wife Miriam would have killed me, and but I wasn't attracted to him that way. Anyway, so the point of the matter was that it was an era, and I don't know. This is a different era, so I don't know if it even makes sense for people now what that was and how it was. So that's
okay.
it. Yeah.
I mean, you just mentioned, I would like to go back to two things.
Yes.
One is New York and the other are the movies.
Yeah.
And let's start with the movies.
Yeah.
Because in so many ways, if we look at your dating notebook through the memoirs, the movies, going to the movies seems to be like the third wheel.
Yeah.
In many of these relationships,
Yes.
meaning so many of these conversations, so many of these transactions take place in the semi-darkness of the cinema. Mm-hmm. So I would like to know more about, I mean, how is film as a place in which people can meet and share the dark and watching something, and how is that part of the zeitgeist or the milieu in which your process as a translator starts to take shape?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, you know, a translator is a close reader, but a reader who's very involved with what the text is doing. And I think when going to movies, well, first of all, movies often were translations of, obviously, stories and books. But going to movies is a way to sort of both escape from your life and sort of maybe aspire to something in your life at the same time. So it's both an escape and a way of aspiring. And I think that, you know, movies were the 20th century art. I mean, that was the art that was invented basically. I know there was some work with it in the 19th century, but basically the art of the 20th century. And so I think all of us in New York, and all over the world, in Latin America, we shared the movies in common. I mean, they spoke to us, and Manuel Puig's works were so important because he talked about the spectator and what the movie meant to the spectator, and how the spectator, in a sense, rewrites the movie, right? And so in some ways, that act of translation is very much what you do as a spectator. You translate your own life, so that, I think that was, and Cabranes-Grant, Puig, Bioy Casares. Well, Bioy Casares' most famous novel was The Invention of Morel, and that's basically about a man who mistakes holograms for actual people. Basically, he's looking up at these people who he thinks are real, and they're not. They're holograms. And so he's totally gets involved with one of the women. He's mad at one of the men because he's trying to be involved with the same woman. And it's all about the spectator also. So curiously enough, the Latin American novel was a very reflective form, self-reflective, and reflecting on the writer, the reader. And so the movies were definitely a great venue for that reflection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And since we are talking about the movies and about Manuel Puig, let's talk, if you don't mind, about the novel, the movie, and the musical that got away.
Oh, yeah.
Which is Kiss of the Spider-Woman.
Yes.
Which you didn't translate.
That's the one I did.
And that's a very important episode in the memoir,
Very
is
important.
to discover why Kiss of the Spider-Woman, is not included in this wonderful display of titles that we can see here.
That's right. Well, because I guess both I and Manuel were spider women, and at that point, who didn't get, well, we'll talk about that. Okay. Anyway, no, the point here is, well, first of all, I'm going to do a little advertising. For those of you who have Criterion, are in touch with the Criterion collection, Kiss of the Spiderwoman was just re-released in January, and guess who's starring in it? S.J. Levine. No, I'm just kidding. Basically, there's the film is there, and that how these Criterion films have all the material that explains what the film is and gives you some material that you wouldn't know, and it's really fun it's like a scholarly entry into the film. So basically, in the supplements, I'm interviewed, and I talk a lot about all of this. And
So you catch up with the Spider-Woman after all.
there you go.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. I'm right there with Sonia Braga and William Hurt and the wonderful Raul Julia. Fabulous cast. Yeah, so basically, Kiss of the Spider-Woman was a clear example of translation, but in my case, what happened was that it was I had just I had translated a third novel of Manuel Puig, which is the Buenos Aires Affair. You can see it up there somewhere. Where is the Buenos Aires? Oh, there you go. Yeah, it's fading. Anyway, but it's a great book, and actually, it was a novel that was of Puig's that was very important as a kind of reflection of fascism in Argentina. It was and how it affected the cultural life. So it was a very interesting novel from a political point of view, as well as being very exaggerated and from the point of view of parody of the detective genre. So anyway, but what happened with Kiss of the Spiderwoman? Well, Puig basically was getting more and more known through his translations, and he now had an agent, and so which at first he didn't want an agent because he felt that agents, all they did was sort of take part of the money and didn't do anything. So, he was when it came to money, he definitely had a special relationship with it, and I won't go into that here. But anyway, you can read it in the book. So anyway, so the point of the matter is that. So he approached me, and at that time, I was about to undertake my first full-time teaching job at Tufts University, and I was, yikes, terrified, because I really, as a graduate student, I had somehow got away with not really having experience with teaching, unlike some of you young people who really get drowned in it before you, So I know that's politically incorrect to say, but anyway, that's all right. But yeah, but what I did first start to teach, actually, and I did teach 3 courses which were translation workshops before I began teaching as a full-time teacher, and that was at NYU, at Yale, and Hunter, and those were important experiences. But nonetheless, I was going to have to teach everything, in a Spanish department, and that was really terrifying. So at that time, Manuel approaches me and says, before that year began, I would love you to translate Kiss of the Spider, El Beso de la Mujer Araña, but we don't have to wait for a publisher. I'll just pay you, I'll give you a flat fee, and you'll do it, and then we'll get a publisher. And I said, gee, after all this translating I did, I sort of feel like I deserve to have a contract like any other writer or translator. So I said, I really don't think I want to do this. Manuel, I really would prefer to have the usual way of, just making a deal between you and me. I don't know, you shouldn't mix business and pleasure. That's one of the things. So, and that was the issue. So anyway, so I didn't translate it, and because he also had his English was wonderful. I mean, he was really very bilingual, but it's not the same thing to be bilingual and to be able to write, a great literary work in English. So, and that's actually something that one can see happening a lot. But so he basically thought he could do without me, and another friend of ours did the translation. And what happened is that the translation had to be edited several times because of that. But I think it was a sad story for me, because I think had I translated Kiss of the Spiderwoman, I don't know, it would have made a big difference, I think, in my career and life at that time. But, I was just following my ethics, my translatorly ethics. So that's how that happened. I don't know if I told the story that you wanted me to tell.
Actually, I'm gonna, before moving to the audience questions,
Yeah.
I would like to push a little more in that direction, because Manuel Puig really changed your life. I mean, one thing that you express in the memoir, I mean, and let's say, the erotic entanglements described in this memoir are extremely fluid, and they move across genders and across generations. And Manuel Puig is a good example of that, because there is a moment when you say that your first lesbian relationship was with Manuel Puig.
Yes, well, he said it. He said he was my first lesbian relationship, and he's right. So he was. And, I mean, he was a little different than your usual, but, yeah, well, those are, as I say, very liberated times, and I guess my bisexuality, I suppose, and I suppose I could finish by saying, by reading, I mean, I suppose what you're saying is I was more than one person, and I think I was. I think also part of why this book works well is because there is more than one voice in it. I think there's both the young Jill and the Jill now, who's both speaking through this book, and I think that's what creates a certain tension and effect.
So you're going to share the entry act?
I'm going to, yes, I'm
Okay,
going to
good.
read. I'm going to read from the entry act before we
Before we go to the audience.
before we go to the afterward. Yeah, the audience. Yeah. Okay. So what page is that on again?
Is part 2 stops along the way?
Yeah. Oh yeah, right. Sorry. I got it. Okay. So there were a couple of this book has a number of different styles in it, and this was more poetic, personal, almost like a diary. It is June 1981. Sorry. Thoughts I wrote while crossing the Great Bay on the Fair Harbor ferry back to the South Shore of Long Island. It is June 1981, except for moments like this, feeling the breeze caress my face, smelling the fresh salt air, looking down at the rushing water. Life sometimes seems like acting rather than being, or seducing and being seduced, only to discover one day that maybe the only way to know love is to know that one is loved. Which person, I, one, she, is speaking? Like all pronouns, I belongs to everyone and to no one. I have lived between two worlds from my early 20s until now, between two ways of speaking English, my first language, and Spanish, the language she translates. Which speaker is the real me? Neither or both. From time to time, I have felt like Alice confronted by the stoned caterpillar seated upon the giant mushroom who defies her imperiously to tell him who she really is. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I think we'll open it up.
Yeah. So let's go now for a QA. There is a microphone that will come to you if you raise your hand and want to participate.
Yes, Roman, yeah.
Thank you very much. Jill, you're going to have to fill in that blank space with your memoir.
That's right. That was the point.
I just want to say the book is wonderful. It reads really quickly. It's funny. It's full of wonderful information, lots of detail, lots of references to that particular period of time. When did you begin to feel comfortable yourself in the company of the various writers that you were translated? When did you feel like you fit in and they accepted you? Because you were a young person at that time.
Yeah. I was a young person. I was a young girl in a way, but I started to get to know folks. I was around 22 at the time, I think. Yeah. 21, 22. And it was basically while I was in graduate school. I don't know. I think that obviously, initially, it was very, overwhelming, to be in a conversation. For example, I describe when I'm with Emir and we're visiting Borges and Bioy Casares and Silvino Campo in Buenos Aires in the fabulous, apartment of Bioy and Silvina. And I said, with that conversation, I felt like a hyphen between Borges and Bioy Casares, and I prefer to stay as a hyphen and let them do the talking. So I would say that in many of those early occasions, especially with very famous people, there was certainly one wanted to just listen and take it all in. But, again, I was, I was a cute kid, and everybody liked me. So I was, and I was always kind of friendly. So basically, it was very easy to become, friends with, and they were like, what's wonderful about great people is that they're usually very simple. And so, getting to know Manuel Puig was wonderful, and Cabra Infante and Sardui. So I think that I wasn't uncomfortable, I mean, I would say that certainly when you're faced with Borges, you would say, oh my God, I better keep my mouth shut or I'll say something really stupid, but and so, I mean, in other words, it is very impressive, but I think that, I don't know, if you had something to say, you said it, and it worked, so, yeah. Yes, Claudio. Hola.
Hello? Oh, yeah, it works, sorry.
Yeah.
Jill, this was wonderful, first of all. Wonderful to see you talk, and I haven't read the book yet, but I have it. What I want to ask you is something. I just read an essay by Pirandello, who actually discusses the translator as in analogy to the actor.
As a what? An
to
analogy?
the actor.
Yes.
So it's
yes.
basically he's reasoning through thinking about the translator
Yes.
just like an actor towards the text.
Absolutely.
Which, sort of, it's very surprising because, of course, we think of actors as necessary in the theater in
Absolutely.
that sense. And where he lands, though, it's where my question is. He lands on saying, the only way for the actor not to become a commedia dell'arte kind of
Commedia dell'arte,
a
yes.
kind of character
Yeah.
actor,
Right.
is to be faithful to the character
Right.
rather than to the author. So I was wondering if you've
Yes.
ever been in a situation with your authors where you might have felt either that the voice of the character had not been coming out from the original, or that you posed yourself the question of actually how to strengthen the character's voice inside, or you've always felt just the faithfulness or unfaithfulness was always a question of your relationship to the author. So have you ever fallen in love with a character, for example?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that basically he's totally right. You're faithful to the character, and you become, as a matter of fact, that summer before I was going to start teaching, and I was so depressed because I was going to be leaving New York for Boston, and which really is not New York. Excuse me. Hello. Yeah. So. So anyway, and so I was translating Bioy's novel, Asleep in the Sun, which had one of his classic characters, a guy who's sort of, he's well-meaning, but he's a real bungler, And, and so I just loved him. I mean, I just loved the well-meaningness and the bunglingness, and I just could identify totally with it. So it was, I was sitting at my desk that summer just giggling with everything he said, and that was how it went. But I would say that the choices I made also, again, if you think of Cabranes-Grant, Puig as the start of my translating, the characters are doing all the talking. So, it's hard to resist as an actor, yeah.
I don't know if you can answer this question. I don't know if you think about this sort of thing, but how do you think or see your own writing in English affected by your relationships with these texts that you translated?
Oh, I think that's a great question. Thank you, Susan, because one of the first times I tried to write a fiction, because I really don't write fiction, although in some ways this is fiction. But, the first time I tried to write fiction, one of the first times actually, because I think I tried, as a kid I probably tried to do silly things, but the first time as a grown-up, I had a literary agent actually because of who had helped me get the publisher for R. Strauss for the Puig biography. So, but we were also talking about Evita, because Evita Perón at that time they were about to, that was coming out, all this interest in Evita as a figure, as a character. So I just out of curiosity I started to read up on her early life, which I know that she and Manuel grew up in a similar sort of culture in the sticks, way out in the pampas, and poverty, basically poverty. And so I basically, in some ways, I guess I was almost consciously, perhaps, writing a little bit like Manuel Puig to write this story, which was called Papa's Funeral, because it's where Evita and her family go to the funeral of the man who's their father, but he doesn't accept that family because he has a legitimate family. So it was a very interesting thing. Yeah, no, Evita she came from, a very questionable background from the point of view of the upper classes and all that. So, so that was, but I do think that, and also in writing the biography, I do think that, no doubt that there was, as a matter of fact, it was really wonderful because I was at Bellagio where I really started to get the style for the biography. And I do think the getting of the style, certainly, I'm sure that the writers that I had, worked with had influenced me. By the way, I tell a very funny story here about Carlos Fuentes, where I translated one novel of his, and where he said, well, the main character is this actress based on a real life Maria Felix, who was a real toughie. And it was about her and her relationship with her gay son, and she was sort of very domineering and stuff. So, but the book itself is very sort of hallucinatory, and what Fuente said, he said, well, I definitely like that Jamesian Baroque thing you're doing, but for her, you have to go to, for Claudia, you have to go to Ross MacDonald or who's that other famous, detective story. You have to get the tough guy, because she talks like a tough guy. So that's you have to talk that way. Like Raymond Chandler. That's right. So that's the style. No Henry James there. That's more Raymond Chandler. So I mean, he gave me that advice, and and I think that when you're writing, I think maybe you're, whether consciously or not, you're influenced by what you've read, and yeah. And what you've translated, for sure.
Your voice.
That's right.
Like, what's your voice?
Where does their voice end and my voice begin, and vice versa? That's definitely a sort of emerging, I say. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this conversation and for having this I'm in the English program, and so I work closely with Leo, and he's done a lot of my training in Latin American literature. And so I really like this whole idea of like this intimacy with the language. It's the intimacy with the writer, and also the language as flesh and the body as flesh. Because one of the works that I have that's in my dissertation is Paradiso. And so
yes.
From its original translation to its English translation, even the embodiment of José Lezama Lima in it is totally gone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so as someone who does the comparative literature, I'm having to sit between not only the original, but also the Buenos Aires translation update 2 years later, and then it's the English translation.
Yeah.
So what advice do you have as a translator for us students that are doing the comparative literature between two or more languages, when you find yourself in a predicament where the embodiment or the flesh as language is totally gone in the English translation?
Oh, you mean when you're reading it and it's gone? Yeah, well, that story of the translation of Paradiso, yes. Well, first of all, it is a very, 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 very difficult work. I mean, the one writer I've translated who actually, he was a disciple, in a sense, or a young friend of Lezama is Severo Sardui. And again, a very exquisite and very multi-leveled and both opaque and yet very lively writer, but filled with all sorts of references and that create a thickness that's quite thick, But I think that, as readers, I mean, it's unfortunate, but there's some books that perhaps don't come through as much as they could. But and honestly, Rabassa didn't want to translate it because he knew that it was beyond what he felt he could do. So he was sort of like, because he did so many really difficult works, he definitely was a great translator of the genre of the magical realism. That was his thing, which it's very Baroque. But yeah, he had a lot of trouble with that, and I actually did. I had a project with Enrico Mario Santi to try to translate the O Piano Licario. And I tell you, we tried the first 10 pages, and Jesus, it was really hard. But I did manage to translate with a couple of his stories for a fiction magazine issue, which was devoted to Cuba, both Cuba outside and inside. That was in 1980. But I don't know if I answered your question. I would just say that that's a very difficult book.
Hi.
Yes.
Thank you. I have two questions. One concerns your navigation of ideology. I mean, you have Borges and then a lot of leftists in in your gallery?
You have to talk louder because I'm almost deaf.
Oh, I said.
I mean, I'm wearing hearing aids, but they don't help a damn.
Okay,
you
I
know
hear
what?
you. I
They're
play
worth
guitar,
thousands
so
of
I have the
dollars.
same problem. I hear you.
Yeah, I'm going to stand up.
I'm just wondering how you navigated ideology in selecting the works that you translated, because you have Borges on one hand and a lot of leftists on the other. So that's one question. How are you engaging that milieu? The other question is more technical. I like what you said about what is lost is the flip side of what is gained.
Yes.
And but still, there's something lost, and there's a certain sonic aspect to the assonant, Romance language that's lost when you're going into English.
Absolutely.
And I had a terrible experience translating, co-translating Americo Paredes' first collection of poetry from 1932. It was a Chicano academic and poet. And he was a classical musician and a folk guitarist. So we just lost all of that, in our translation, because it was translation by committee, so then it wound up being more literal than figural, and we just lost that. So how have you navigated that? That probably is in your book. I haven't read it, but I definitely will now.
Well, I think I've all the writers I've translated are revolutionary, including Borges. Borges, of course, Borges is known to the general public as the writer who made the mistake of shaking hands with Pinochet and things like that, right? But Borges, when he started out, basically he was an anarchist socialist, and as our dear departed friend Efraín Cristal, one of the most brilliant critics and scholars of Latin American literature, who just died recently and wrote an amazingly wonderful book about Borges. Actually, two books, one about Borges in translation and the other about Borges in war. So actually, Borges is much more political in a good sense than people know, because the Borges is the older blind Borges who didn't read newspapers and shook hands with the wrong people. Okay. But the Borges of the 1940s, who wrote Ficciones and all his most wonderful stories, all those stories are couched in the fear, the tremendous nightmarish quality of what was going on with World War II. World War II imbues all those stories. So he was a very political writer, but he was not seen that way because it seems like it's fantastic and hallucinatory, but extremely political. So, but I do think that, I guess for me, they were revolutionary, even if their politics at the time, for Cabral Infante, for example, he was a critic of Fidel because his parents were the founders of the Communist Party of Cuba. He had an important role culturally when the revolution came about. So he was really part of the revolution, but he, like other writers and other artists, he was very upset about and opposed censorship, because there was a lot of censorship going on, and after some time, gay writers were obviously being more than censored. They were thrown into concentration camps and things. So the politics is very tricky, the ideology. But I think that, for example, ideology, I think that's why I think Puig was interesting, because the way he dealt with the whole issue of sexual politics, even though he himself was maybe not so, liberated all the time, but what he wrote about and how he wrote about it was really very important, I think, politically. Yeah. Oh, yes.
I've always wanted to ask a translator about titles. This may be common knowledge among translators, but it's such a small part of a work, and yet it's kind of
It's a big thing.
It's a temptation into reading a text, like the cover of a book. And so I wonder, I know sometimes this comes under the jurisdiction of a marketing strategy to certain demographics, and it might not be your choice, but I've always wanted to ask what goes into that, and how does that work? How does unfaithfulness maybe come into play?
A very good question, and almost all the titles that are up here, I could talk for hours about what went on with the titles. What was great about La Traición de Rita Hayworth, what was great about La Traición de Rita Hayworth is that the word betrayal is in there, but you know that she's the one who's betraying, okay? She's the main one who's betraying, although the betrayers are more than one, but in terms of the grammar, you know that she's the betrayer. And so basically, if you put the betrayal of Rita Hayworth, it would have been very ambiguous. Is it she being betrayed or is she betraying? So basically, I turned it into a past participle, betrayed by Rita Hayworth, which of course sounded also a lot more, Hollywood and pulpy, so that was, which was also the idea. But the titles are very important, because you read the book through the title. The title really is a summation in some ways of the book, from not only in terms of theme, but in terms of style and everything. So, and actually, well, here's a funny story with Manuel Puig. So the second book was a very hard title to come up with, Boquitas Pintadas, Little Painted Lips. So, and many people still think it should have been Little Painted Lips, and maybe if we translate it now, it might have been Little Painted Lips, okay? But then that sounded awkward, Little Painted Lips, So we had to come up with a title, and we came out with Heartbreak Tangle, but it was after a very elaborate process, which I describe in The Subversive Scribe. And I think that Manuel, I don't know if he was joking or not, but the next title was The Buenos Aires Affair in Spanish, because I don't want to have that same problem with the title. I mean, that took too long and it was too problematic. The Buenos Aires Affair, that's it. So, and of course it was perfect to be in English, in the Spanish. Yeah. Good question.
You mentioned being there when, you mentioned being witnessing. Yeah, that's the word, sorry.
Yes.
You mentioned witnessing the birth of the translation studies as a discipline.
Yes.
And I was wondering, as a practitioner, how you would define your relationship with translation theory in general.
That's very good. Well, I guess my book is an example of how I relate to it. There's so much you can do with theory, and this book takes it, I think, further. This book is actually part of a series that is called Translated By, and basically the series editors chose me to be the person who inaugurated the series. And why it's called Translated By, because it's going to be books, and already others have been written, that are written either by or about the translator as the figure. In other words, the translator's subjectivity becomes central to understanding the whole issue of translation. So this is actually a move to another, let's say, stage of translation theory. And I think translation theory is a lot of fun, and there's so many, like for example, so many aspects you can go into of translation, but ultimately, practice and theory are not necessarily that related. I mean, sometimes they are, but often they aren't. So that is an issue, but that's probably true of many fields, I suppose, no? I mean, I don't know. What do you think, Dwight? You have a... you're a theoretician. Both
theoretician and practitioner.
And practitioner. That's right. You're both practitioner and theoretician. Okay. But yeah, no, I think that it really is, but I do think that, for me it was very important to write a theoretical book, which was The Subversive Scribe, because I felt that there was something that was missing out there that had to be really explored and declared, so, yeah.
Well, thank you. I think it's time to not end the conversation, but interrupt the conversation so we can follow up by joining the wine and the food and the wonderful company in which we are. Please join me in saying, to Professor Levine, how delightful it has been to talk to her, and how we look forward to the third installment of this trilogy.
Oh, you mean the fourth one?
The fourth one, in this case. Yes, exactly.
Well,
because I'm sure that the story continues.
Thank you.
So thank you, and thank you again to the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center and to all of you
Yes,
for
and
being
to-
here with us. Oh,
And
okay.
thank
Yes,
you,
thanks to me.
Leo, for being here, because you really made a difference. Leo, it's really great.
Now, let's join the party. Thank you.